Greetings, all. This is 15 minutes or less with the professor. I'm your host, Professor Keys, and the topic today is Black on Black violence, a solution through psychological transformation from studying African history to combat self hate, an identity crisis, and a lack in knowledge of self. In tribute to the late, great, legendary boxing referee Mills Lane, let's get it on. Black on Black violence. Renowned Harlem gangster Eldridge Bumpy Johnson once offered his combative services to his longtime acquaintance Malcolm X concerning the troubles that Malcolm was having with the Nation of Islam during their split. Bumpy said to Malcolm, quote, "Well, you know how to handle that, man. All you got to do is make a phone call and that be taken care of," unquote. Without hesitation, Malcolm X refused to accept the offer from his bellicose associate because at that point in his life, his attitude was, quote, "I don't want black folks killing black people," unquote. Black on black violence has been a phenomenon that has existed in the United States since African Americans were conditioned into that behavior on the slave plantations. In order for African Americans as a people to overcome this condition and break the cycle, it will require that they, like Brother Malcolm, undergo a psychological transformation by way of learning African history, which will combat the catalysts to the success of black on black violence, which are unequivocally black self hate, an identity crisis, and a lack in knowledge of self. Black self hate. Malcolm X was no longer willing to be complicit in black on black violence because he had transformed his once very negative outlook toward Africans and African Americans that he and the rest of African Americans had been so thoroughly brainwashed into endorsing. African Americans have been conditioned into a mindset of self hate, and when you hate yourself, consequently, you will hate all of those others who are the same as you. Malcolm X is one of the most qualified individuals to have ever explained how African Americans were conditioned into this attitude of self-hate. Malcolm said, quote, "Number one, you have to realize that up until 1959, Africa was dominated by the colonial powers. Having complete control over Africa, the colonial powers of Europe projected the image of Africa negatively. They always project Africa in a negative light. Jungle savages, cannibals, nothing civilized. Why then naturally it was so negative that it was negative to you and me, and you and I began to hate it. We didn't want anybody telling us anything about Africa, much less calling us Africans. And hating Africa and then hating the Africans, we ended up hating ourselves without even realizing it," unquote. In regards to black on black violence, when you hate yourself and others like you, you may have a willingness to harm yourself and to harm those others who are like you. On the other hand, when you love yourself and you love those others who are like you may not be willing to harm yourself or to harm those others who are like you. Before Malcolm X learned to love himself as an African American and developed the ability to love other African Americans, he was willing to harm himself and to harm other African Americans. But after he acquired the love for himself as an African American, he was no longer willing to harm himself or to harm other African Americans. An identity crisis. In resolving his issues of self hate, in essence, Malcolm also solved his identity crisis. This identity crisis that afflicts most African Americans is due in most part to the value system of United States capitalism materialism. The three most prominent values that contribute to this identity crisis are, as Dr. Leonard Jeffries has termed them, the ICE: individualism, competition, and exploitation. First value of focus is individualism. The desire to become the super individual is what makes this value problematic. The super individual is the person who has achieved tremendous status. The ways in which the person achieves this status is through acquiring status symbols, which can be accomplished through various means. Status symbols include all of those things that, once obtained by an individual, it generally evokes laudatory praise from the other members of the community, usually in the form of the compliment, "You're the man." Some of these status symbols include the acquisition of a great amount of the most popular name brand fashion items, which Thorsten Veblen has labeled conspicuous consumption. Another form of status symbols for men is women. The man who has the ability to have sexual relations with the greatest number of women achieves tremendous status. And of course, there's a double standard attached to this one. Women are vilified for such behavior. Another form is by way of pugilistic conquest. The man or woman who can beat up or knock out the greatest number of people achieves great status for doing such. There are other forms of status symbols, but since our focus is on black violence, we will concentrate here. The individual who resort to these different actions in attempting to acquire status symbols is displaying a behavior that Dr. Amos Wilson calls reactionary masculinity, which is a distorted reality of what real manhood is. A distorted reality is an identity crisis, and the motivation that compels an individual to act out reactionary masculinity is the desire to establish a positive self-esteem. The reactionary masculinity that accompanies this identity crisis is a result of a lowered self-esteem, and this low self-esteem is a result of the individual failing to achieve real manhood values. Now the question becomes, what are real manhood values? Real manhood values simply consist of the ability of a person to provide for himself and or to provide for his family by being responsible enough and resourceful enough to obtain a legal job that will enable him to accomplish these things. This accomplishment will achieve a positive self-esteem. Unfortunately, due to discriminatory factors that I will explain in the next 2 points of my thesis, it appears that the majority of African Americans fail to accomplish this. Next value of capitalism that has destructive consequences on African Americans that contribute to black on black violence is competition. We have to add another factor here, and that factor is poverty. Impoverished African Americans everywhere that this system of capitalism, materialism exists in the world experience this conditioning process of competition, and it develops in them a drive to be as competitive as they can be. When you combine this competitive drive within these impoverished African American individuals with the reality that each individual's self-worth is determined by how many material assets they possess, your understanding of how these ingredients can procure an end that result in black on black violent activity becomes very clear. Through psychological manipulation of capitalist ideas, these impoverished African Americans are conditioned into accepting a definition of success and or a definition of reality that claims success to be a quantitative association with material assets, opposed to a qualitative association with things spiritual or humanitarian. As a result, these impoverished African Americans often feel poorer than they actually are. The carrot that is being dangled above their heads or above their means is the impetus that causes the impoverished African American individual to covet. Consequently, the result too often is to succumb to the temptation to commit black on black violence. This temptation is chiefly due to the frustration concomitant with the inability to obtain enough material assets that will enable an impoverished African American individual to remain competitive in this aspect of life. The carrot is in various forms, including commercial advertisement, which all members of the society are bombarded with, Other forms in which this carrot presents itself include the display of material assets by members of the middle and upper classes that come into contact or into view of these impoverished African American individuals. There is even a display of material assets that have been obtained by some members of the poor class communities in which these impoverished African American individuals themselves live. The entertainment business is also guilty of dangling carrots. In music videos, especially hip hop, there is such an extravagant display of materialism that it appears to be more of a commercial for capitalism advertisement than a music video. Finally, Hollywood movies and television shows have been misguiding and miseducating American society, and in particular, impoverished African Americans, for as long as they have been in business. The display of materialism in the form of antagonistic and agonizing competition is on full display for all impressionable, impoverished African American individuals to be victimized by. It is instructive to acknowledge a great point that Dr. Amos Wilson offers concerning this concept of black on black violence and exploitation. He stated, quote, black on black violence is not merely an expression of personal and individual anger or merely the result of a psychopathological personality, but is more the result of a psychopathological social system, unquote. He continues, quote, I want to impress upon people that black on black violence serves a social function, that in effect it becomes unnecessary part of the functioning American system. In a sense, it operates to maintain this system, unquote. A lack in knowledge of self. The Honorable Dr. John Henrik Clarke, in explaining the efforts of the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, stated, quote, he showed you what you once were, so you knew what you had to become, unquote. Before capitalism, African people lived under socialism in which there was no concept of ownership of property and there was no class inequality. Hence, a person's self-worth was not determined on a material scale by status or status symbols. It was determined on a spiritual scale by qualities such as honesty, integrity, sincerity, character, etc. Therefore, the principles and values of individualism, competition, and exploitation were non-existent. There were no such inhumane concepts such as every man for himself or survival of the fittest, only the strong survive. Last but not least, African people were the leaders of the world in education, the first to master mathematics, astronomy, music, archaeology, the plastic arts, all of the humanities, liberal arts, all of the sciences, architecture, sculpture, medicine, religion, mythology, and philosophy. Speaking of philosophy, do you know that Egyptian philosophers lived 2,000 years before any of the Greek philosophers were even born? This is what Garvey was trying to show you about yourself. And once you learn these things about yourself, you have such a high level of self-esteem and such tremendous pride and respect for yourself and all others who are like you that you won't be interested in doing any type of violence to any of them. You will be too magnanimous for that. Conclusion. Malcolm X said, quote, if you don't stand for something, you will fall for anything, unquote. In regards to black on black violence and some of its causes such as black self-hate, an identity crisis, and a lack in knowledge of self, learn your African history so that you will learn to stand for what it represents and stop falling for the denunciating characterizations of you, which are the products of your miseducation through the racist educational institutions in the capitalist materialist United States. Learn to stand for giving birth to civilization. Learn to stand for the principles of equality and a caring and sharing value system. And since we are discussing black on black violence, learn to stand for having the highest reverence for human life because this is what your African history teaches you. Thanks for having an audience with me.